So we are starting our afternoon with another keynote speaker, our international speaker, Dr. David Hammond. He's going to be talking about high-THC cannabis products, trends in consumer use, adverse outcomes, and implications for policy in legal cannabis markets. Dr. David Hammond is a professor and university research chair at the School of Public Health Sciences, University of Waterloo. More information on his bio is available in your package, or if you're watching from home, online. So let's welcome Dr. David Hammond.
Hi there, everybody. I really wish I could be there with you in person. I know how beautiful the Pacific Northwest is. I have family in Vancouver, and I still remember about 25 years ago driving my 1981 Toyota Tercel to the University of Washington from Vancouver. It was a great conference. I was even happier that I got home and my car made it. So I'm sorry I can't be there with you, but what a great day of presentations. In terms of disclosures, I have no industry funding or commercial interest to declare. I do serve as a paid expert witness in testimony, including cannabis. This is where I defend governments from legal challenges from the industry. Next slide, please. And what you're going to be hearing from me today is a lot of what you've heard from the other speakers. And I've spent a lot of time working tobacco control. And, you know, we talk a lot about the date of legalization, but of course, we can have many different types of markets. That's what today is all about. And I always like to remind people that, you know, tobacco cigarettes have always been legal in the United States and Canada, but we have a substantially different market today. And that's because the way we regulate these products is much different. I was going to say next slide. And of course, you know, we don't have one legal market in the US. You have 19 adult use legal markets. You have different medical markets in different states, and that's because they're regulated differently. Next slide. And you know, so obviously some of the questions we're talking about today is not just whether products should be legal, but what sort of rules and standards should we have? And, you know, Vermont and Connecticut, to my knowledge, have some laws, but I'm going to be talking to you today about some of the real different regulatory frameworks that we have in Canada. Next slide. And I've also been asked to talk a little bit about product labeling and warnings, which appear on packages. And again, some of the differences between states, but more importantly, the bigger differences that we see between Canada's legal market and the US. Next slide. And by the way, you're going to be hearing me say next slide a lot, but we are almost at the 4th anniversary of federal national legalization in Canada. We had a medical cannabis since 2001. But as I've just alluded to, we have quite a bit, we have some similarities. We also have some real differences in our market. And I'm a researcher, we talk about natural experiments. And this is an opportunity to learn about whether those different laws and regulations are having any impact on consumers. Next slide. And so I'm going to be bludgeoning you with some slides and figures and results from what we call the International Cannabis Policy Study. And basically, what is it? These are national surveys. I'll describe them in just a minute. But the goal here is to get detailed population-based data. Obviously, you've got great prevalence surveys with NSDA and BRFSS, but we need more detail to understand what's happening with cannabis legalization. We also need measures that are more specific to policies and regulations. And we need this data consistently over time with the same methods across the different jurisdictions so we can compare. Next slide. And I promise whoever is advancing the slides, first of all, thank you. And I will remember to say next slide. So very briefly, these are national surveys. They're repeat cross-sectional, so we're not following the same people over time. We're getting a fresh sample. And we do these every year. We do them in September, October. We're in the field right now with our 2022 survey. One thing to remember is that we have a restricted age range of 16 to 65. That's because that's where most of the cannabis consumers are, and it's just a efficiency sort of funding thing from our end. Same methodology. We actually do the study in 4 countries. We started in Australia and New Zealand, but most of what I'm going to be showing you today is from the US and Canada. Next slide. And I promise this is the only methods piece that I'm going to show you, but we source our respondents from commercial panels. I mentioned we do our surveys in the fall. And all the data I'm showing you today are weighted on sex, age, region, race, smoking rates over time, and education. And our sample sizes have varied, but they're typically around 45 to 50,000, which includes about 30,000 in the US over the last few years. And we do oversample legal states. So many different states have provided us funding to oversample, including Washington. Next slide. And so we actually produce a report specific to Washington. I'm not going to be showing a lot of data for Washington, but we have this for the US and Washington, and we have lots more detail in our technical reports online. So there you go. That's the methods. Happy to answer any questions. Next slide. So one of the unique parts, I mentioned we need detail. So we ask a lot of questions, not just about different types of products, but how much they use. Next slide. When, in the old days, maybe we had one type of joint size. We allow people to, report different joint size. We have all sorts of problematic use indicators. Next slide. And we have what we call policy-specific measures. So we ask them, have you seen any advertising or marketing? Where have you seen it? How much did you pay? What type of store did you buy from? We figure out how close people live in proximity to legal retail stores. We ask them whether they've noticed health warnings. So this is what we call policy-specific measures. Next slide. And then what we do is we go and we actually dig up the laws and regulations from different states or Canadian provinces, and that's the basis for comparing them. We say, well, if they have different rules, if they have different retail density, how does that translate into some of our outcomes? Next slide. So that's my intro. What am I going to talk to you about today? I'm going to start by talking about patterns of use. I'm going to talk a little bit about adverse events, and then a little bit about health warnings and product labeling, and a little bit about, or a lot more about product standards, which we've already heard. Next slide. So, look, a lot of what I'm going to share dovetails really nicely with what you've heard from some of the presentations this morning. And let's just take sort of a really high-level look at how patterns of use are changing. I promise you I'll say next slide when we need to get to the next slide. Next slide. We've published a lot of this quite recently. I'm going to be showing you data from a more recent year, but I'm happy to share papers and publications for details. Next slide. So this is a snapshot. And what I'm showing you here is of those in the US, in our surveys, who report using cannabis in the past month, what percentage use each types of product? And what you can see is, and this looks like what Julia shared from Oregon, which is the proportion using dried flower has actually decreased. So dried flower remains the dominant product form, but it is going down. And essentially, you can see that every other category has gone up. You can see, especially large increases for edibles. Vape oils is that gray line, and you can see that little dip between 2019 and 2020. Well, that's a valley. That's where people got a bit of a cold chill from using vapes, but they've largely resumed using them by 2021. But what you can see is increases in all those more concentrated forms, called them process, extract forms, along with a reduction in dried flower. Next slide. Now, when we report these things in surveys, we often report them in isolation. And I've been spending some time in the last few weeks sort of looking through co-use of different products. And the bottom line is that most US cannabis consumers use multiple products. So you can see that only about a quarter of them tell us that they've used a single product in the last year. Another quarter say 2 products. And you can see that about 13% say that they're using 5 products or more. So actually, about 3/4 of cannabis consumers are using more than one product in the past year. That's important for us to know, especially if we're trying to separate out patterns of use and things like adverse outcomes. Next slide. And I just wanted to point, I think this is the only time I'm showing you data from our New Zealand and Australia surveys. Most of you will know that they do have medical cannabis in both New Zealand and Australia, but it's very restricted. It doesn't look like most US states. But I just point this out here because, there are very different trends across countries. Now, Canada often looks like the US. We have one of the highest prevalence of cannabis use in the world as well. But you can see that none of our countries compares to the US in terms of the poly use, the use of multiple products. So you can see, New Zealand and Australia at sort of one end. But the US, it looks like the most diverse market out there. And that's going to be a theme. Next slide. And if you look among those who tell us that they're only using one product, most of those folks, exclusive use of dried flower is the most common. Have a look on the far left side. When I say concentrate, I mean like solid concentrate, like wax and shatter and things like that. It is very rare that somebody only uses that type of product without using other products. So you can see that sole or exclusive use of flower and edibles is most common. And after that, virtually everybody that are using those extracts are using at least one other product, most of them dried flower. Next slide. Now, I've been showing you sort of use in the past 12 months. That's often what you see in different surveys and things like that. But if you look at monthly use or something less frequently, let me say that the other way. If you look at more frequent use, like daily use, it looks different. So earlier I showed you that edibles were far and away the second most popular product that are used on an annual basis. But you can see here that actually they're less likely to be used on a daily basis. So as always, it's daily users are most likely to say that they use flower daily. You can see that about 8% tell us that they use vape liquids daily. It's 5% for concentrates. So although fewer people are trying those, say, on an annual basis, they're more likely to use those products on a daily basis. And of course, it speaks to the fact that people are using these products for different reasons. And edibles might be more likely to be used for a particular occasion or going out or whatever it might be, whereas flower, concentrates, and vape liquids seem to be more a part of a daily regular pattern of use. Next slide. And John referred to this earlier, and that is that, in addition to thinking about frequency of use, we need to think about how much people are using. And we have very, very little data, especially at the population level. And what we find, so we get all that data and that people self-report to us, that on average, consumers report using 1.4 grams of dried flower per day. Now you can see that that really varies by frequency of use. And in our survey, it's up to 2 grams of flower among daily users. So it's a bit of a double whammy in that those folks are using it more often, and when they do use it, they're using more on a daily basis. Next slide. And I think, again, John may have alluded to this, and I've seen other studies where it's around 80% or the low 80s. But when we try and estimate what percent of dried flower consumption is accounted for by people that use cannabis daily, it's a whopping amount. So again, if you put together the more frequent use and then the fact that they use more on the days that they do use cannabis, in our study, daily consumers or near daily consumers account for about 80% of all the consumption of dried flower. This is important if we're trying to think about public health burden and project it, because the burden is very likely going to rest with those folks. And you can see that, for example, monthly or less than monthly consumers account for just a fraction of the consumption. So it's starting to fill out the picture, not just in terms of overall prevalence, but really where which subgroups are driving consumption. Next slide. And where we really have honestly an embarrassingly low amount of data or evidence is on consumption patterns for things other than dried flower. And it's partly because it's trickier. It's partly because a lot of the big surveys don't actually ask questions on it. But for example, in our survey, when we ask about solid concentrates, people tell us that on the days that they use them, they use about 1.2 grams. So the diversity of the product forms is a huge challenge for us in terms of monitoring and surveillance, but I think we need to get up to speed with the market and start actually measuring some of these other forms in greater detail as they increase in popularity. Next slide. So super quick summary. No surprise to anybody, wide diversity of products. Poly product use is the norm, it's not the exception. So we can't put people into little silos quite as easily as we can for some other substances. And we see a really pronounced march towards the use of extracts, but we really lack some of the consumption data, again, at the population level where we need it. Next slide. So, one of the questions is, what's the role of legalization and different regulations? So let's take a look at that. Next slide. And I apologize for my shorthand. I know I should be saying adult use, but I'm just going to be using the shorthand of illegal, medical, and legal. Now, what I've done here is, I think these are the only slides where I've put the Washington State data from our surveys. But what I'm showing you again is the use of different products among past 12-month consumers. And that's to kind of iron out some of the prevalence differences, just to ask if consumers in different jurisdictions are using different products. And what we see is actually, we used to see bigger differences between illegal medical and legal states a few years ago when we started, about 4 years ago. What we've seen is that a lot of those differences have narrowed over time. So you can see that, at least in our survey, the prevalence of edible use among past 12-month consumers is pretty consistent. That's the same as dried flower. Next slide. And we also see very few differences between illegal medical and legal states in terms of the use of oral drops or capsules, the use of vape oils. Next slide. Not much difference in solid concentrates. The one area where we do see, we still see a bit of a difference is in beverages. And I think there's probably a couple of reasons for that. Beverages have increased more recently as a popular form. Beverages are a little bit harder and to my knowledge, more rare on the illegal market. They just involve more manufacturing and processing. So we still see a bit of a difference there. And for whatever reason, Washington State seems to pop up a little higher than some of the other legal states. Next slide. And, you know, we saw some slides from earlier speakers about who's using each of these product types. Next slide. Very briefly, you know, a lot of studies either are just done with medical cannabis users, or at least there's questions about whether they differ. Typically, we see that medical consumers have higher levels of consumption. They're also more likely to use what I'll call extracts. That's particularly true for oral liquids, which are associated often with sort of therapeutic use. But you can see it's also true for edibles, concentrates, vape liquids. The only time we don't see a difference is flower. So a more you know, frequent, intense consumer, as you might expect, not just in terms of frequency of use, but also the use of high THC extracts. Next slide. What about sex differences? Well, you know, in terms of the product choice, we see some. Typically, males are a little bit higher for some of the extracts, but it's not major, at least in our data. Where we see more difference is solid concentrates, with males being a little bit higher than females. And interestingly, edibles are the one product category where females are similar to or maybe even a little bit higher than males. Next slide, please. And we've heard a lot about age, the age of consumer, and it is absolutely true, at least in our data, that younger consumers you know, have the extracts are more common among younger consumers. So each line is a different product, and the slope or shape of the line tells you the prevalence as our age group goes up. And you can see that, you know, most of the extracts are, you know, peak at youth and young adulthood, and then they taper off. Edibles, the orange line, are pretty popular across all age groups, but you can see vapes, the yellow line, and solid concentrates. Those are the most heavily graded, show the biggest gradient by age, whereas flower is the opposite. So most older consumers seem to be sticking with flower. Next slide. Okay, and what I want to do is just pull out some of our most recent trends from our 2021 data. Next slide. And, you know, these won't be news to a lot of you who follow legal sales estimates. But, you know, I mentioned to you that we allow people to pick the joint size. And when they do the survey, we make sure that actually the size of the picture of the joint is, we use a bottle cap to help them judge how big it is. And the bottom line is that we can't be asking, you know, we can't be assuming one size for joints. Joints differ 5-6-fold in terms of size. And what we find is that 40% of those who smoke joints pick either 1.2 grams or 1 grams as their typical joint size. And I'm not going to show you the data, but I can tell you that that has increased even in the last 4 years of our study. And that almost surely has to do with the fact that people are buying more pre-rolled joints. And 1 gram is 0.5 and 1 gram are the most popular sizes of pre-rolled joints that you can purchase. But the days of assuming that all the joints are 0.3 or 0.4 grams, A, that's too small, and B, we're missing out on a lot of important variability. Next slide. And so, you know, I just said it, but what we're seeing is not just a shift towards extracts, but even in the flower category, we're seeing more of it shifting to what I'll call processed flower products, including pre-rolls. Next slide. So we ask people, okay, at your last purchase when you bought dried flower, what percentage of them were in the pre-roll form. And 1/3 of people say, yeah, the last time I bought flower, I bought a pre-rolled joint. And you can see that does vary by jurisdiction. Flower consumers that live in adult legal states much higher than those that live in illegal states. So that obviously reflects the manufacturing process associated with legalization, but this has gone up a lot. It's consistent with all the sales data I've seen and like the headset analyses and things like that. Next slide. The other thing that's happening is that when you look at pre-rolled, we're seeing more infused products. Most dried flower pre-rolled joints top out in the mid to high 20s for THC. And at first we thought it was an error where we were seeing both really expensive joints being reported in our data, but also, things like 40% THC. But it's, of course, because these are infused products. These are premium price products, and they're increasing. And, the companies like them because there's more of a profit margin, but never mind thinking about dried flower as 25% versus 5%. We're now in the 40% THC levels for these infused pre-rolled joints. Next slide. And of course, and I'm not going to spend much time talking about it, but, we also monitor the use of what I'll call non-THC CBD only products. We have about 27% of all respondents in our survey tell us that they've tried a CBD product in the past 12 months. Next slide. And just to make things more difficult for anyone who does work in this space, we've started to ask about Delta-8 THC products. Next slide. And I just want to pause here for a minute because it was New York State first said to us, hey, we really want to ask about this. And so we did some pilot work and we were sort of asking about Delta-8 THC, and a lot of people were saying yes. And so what we did is a bit of a twist. We actually we asked people about other forms. Delta-9, of course, the most common, and then we picked 4 that, as far as I know, don't exist on the commercial market, Delta-4 and Delta-10. Next. And what we find is it's a bit blurry on my screen, so I can't give you the actual number there. But whatever the number that says on the screen, 15% or something, that looks like a lot of people that have heard about Delta-8. Next slide. But here's the kicker. You can see that actually less than that said they'd heard of Delta-9. And we have lots of folks saying they've heard of Delta-4 and Delta-10, which really they shouldn't have as a general consumer. Next slide. When you break that out over illegal medical and legal states, you do see the biggest gradient for Delta-8. In other words, people living in illegal states are most likely to say they'd heard of Delta-8. Now, that's what we might expect, given that these products would be more popular in the jurisdictions that don't allow sort of regular THC products. So some of this is probably valid, but anyone who asks in a survey about Delta-8, you're probably going to get a fair amount of overreporting, and that's what our findings are suggesting. Next slide. And when we break it all out, we get 3% of everyone telling us that they've ever used a Delta-8 THC product. But again, there's a big fat asterisk on that because a lot of those folks are probably confused about what Delta-8 is and what THC is. Next slide. And I'm going to come back to what consumers know and understand about THC in a minute. But I'm going to talk about adverse events first. Next slide. Now, I think Julia and Rosalie presented some data from sort of administrative healthcare records. That will always be the gold standard. What you get in population-based surveys is, on the one hand, you get higher estimates. And that's because people are also reporting adverse events for which they didn't seek medical help. There's probably a bit of over-reporting anyway. But what we're interested in is, again, differences between jurisdictions and trends over time. And we can also get more information about products. You heard Julia say that the ICD-10 code just says cannabis. Well, what products were they using? Next slide. And so, I find it very interesting to note that just about 31% of all past 12-month cannabis users told us that they experienced an adverse event. Now, we asked them about what type, and a lot of it is, fairly modest stuff, or I felt dizzy, that sort of thing. But to sort of distinguish between more serious ones, we do ask whether they sought medical help. Next slide. And this is what we see. We can see that overall, 9% of all the past 12-month cannabis consumers in our study told us that they sought medical help in the past year for an adverse event caused by cannabis use. That is high. You can see that it's a little bit higher in medical and legal states compared to consumers in illegal states. Next slide. And this is what it looks like over the 4 years that we've been doing our survey. So, a bit of shifting and sorting across those three sort of legal jurisdictions, but you can see that by 2021, consumers in each of those three jurisdictions were pretty much, in the same spot. And what we've seen is sort of like all the healthcare data, a gradual increase over time, even across this relatively short 4-year period. Next slide. So we ask where people have sought assistance, and this is the other trick is, people don't just call the poison center. They don't just go to the ER. They do different things. And so, you can sort of break out what source of support and help they're looking for. Next slide. But here's where I'm trying to get to here. When people in our survey tell us they've experienced an adverse event, we say, what type of product were you using when you experienced the adverse event? And this is what people tell us. Now, a lot of the narrative around adverse events in the media and the public is around edibles. Now, that's understandable because accidental consumption among young people is of particular concern, and most of that is edibles. But you can see that actually, when you do a population-based study and you have information on the product, far more people are saying they were using dried flower when they experienced the event than edibles. Edibles only about 10% of the time. And you can see that it's distributed across all of these. Next slide. There's another way of looking at that, and that's of the people who used each product, because we know some products are more popular than others, right? Flower being the most popular. Of those who use each product, how many of them said that they experienced an adverse event? And you can see that actually the likelihood of experiencing an adverse event is similar. So it's a little lower among flower, but we have so many flower users. That's why we have more adverse events attributed to flowers. But you can see that this is not a simple narrative of it being driven by one particular category or including categories that have substantially higher THC levels than others. Next slide. And I think the reason for that is that what I'll call consumer THC literacy is shockingly low. Now, most of us, we have these nice units called cigarettes. Most of us have a sense of drinks, even if we have trouble with the standard drink versus the alcohol, but we know that about a shot is a glass of wine is about a beer. But people's understanding of strength of cannabis and THC levels is shockingly low. And I just want to show you a couple pieces here. Next slide. First of all, and I've shown these slides in a bunch of different presentations, but, again, when you do this type of work, you have to figure out, should we be using the term marijuana or cannabis or whatever? Well, one of the things we did is an experiment where people saw different pictures. And we showed some people a picture of a THC oil, some people a picture that just said CBD oil, and another group a picture that said CBD and THC oil. And by the way, we did the same thing with like vaping products and other things. And we just simply asked people, we showed them the picture and said, do you think this is a marijuana product? Next slide. And this is what people said. Only 65% thought THC oil was a product. When you take that out and just label CBD, it goes down to about 46%. Then when you put them both on, it's 74%. So I guess that's most people kind of getting things right. But the flip side of this is that people don't make the association between THC and marijuana or cannabis nearly as much as we might think. Next slide. Well, we asked them in the next question, we kept the same picture on the screen and we just said, hey, can this product get someone high? So forget about what you call it. Do you think this is an intoxicating product? And look at that, only 42% said that THC oil, would get someone high. You can see that they're kind of getting the idea with CBD. It goes down to 12, but when you put THC and CBD, it's pretty much the same as THC. So even at this most basic level, people struggle to differentiate between these major product categories that we assess and often speak of. Next slide. And just to draw a line underneath all of this, of those who consume dried flower, we say, hey, do you know the amount of the THC of the dried herb that you last used? We also ask usual. I'm just showing you last. So first of all, only 25% of flower users tell us, yeah, they know the number. And then you can see that it does vary whether they tell us they know the number based on frequency. But even among daily users, it only tops out at about a third, 31%. So those are the folks that say, yeah, I know what it is. Next slide. So then we go, okay, so you know what it is. So what THC level do you typically use in your dried flower? And the average, the mean, was 38%. Well, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is, like, you can't, unless it's an infused product, you can't manufacture a product. There's no, to my knowledge, there's no products above 30% available for commercial sale. So the average people are telling us basically doesn't exist. And you can see that even among daily consumers, they're giving us numbers that are far too high. Bottom line, most people don't know the THC numbers. Next slide. This is a big pain for us. Wouldn't it be nice in population surveys if we could just ask and people could report it? But we went a step further and we said, okay, let's pick 30% THC for dried flower because that's as high as it can get. And we just said, hey, maybe people are using like low, medium, and high as descriptors. And when we ask people, is 30% THC low, medium, or high for dried flower, you can see that people are all over the shop. Most people, the gray bars, say, I don't know. We have about 40% to a third that think 30% THC for dried flower is low. There's a little bit of a difference across like all US, medical, legal, and in Canada. There's a slight suggestion that legalization might help with this because they get it a bit more correct, but it's pretty dismal. And it tells us that even in the broad sort of descriptor qualitative way, people don't really understand THC numbers or THC levels. Next slide. And of course, you know, this is an excellent argument for standardized THC units. And I'm sure you all know that sort of NIDA has endorsed this in research. I'm hosting a group that's discussing this in Canada, thinking about what could its use be in a regulatory environment. I'm not going to show you pictures today, but I have not, you know, the way we label THC across products, it differs whether it's percent, milligrams, you know, concentration levels. It's different for edibles and smoked products. And we do a horrible job in Canada. I'm embarrassed to say that the first week of legalization, when the products came out, I had to call my contact in Health Canada, and they consulted me on this and say, I'm embarrassed to say this, but I don't understand these two numbers. So we need to think about how we can make this easier, not just for research studies, but for consumers to understand these products. And there's different ways of doing this, but boy, we need some harmonization to really help consumers. I always, this is my standard line, which is a well-regulated market is one where people can figure out how much to consume. And right now, I think that is actually the reason why we see adverse events across a range of products. It's not just the inherent properties of any one product. Next slide. Okay, and yeah, so we actually asked people, do you think this would help? Next slide. And people go, yeah. Most people say either, like, yeah, I'd like to see that. 70% of consumers say, I'd like some sort of standard amount of THC. Next slide. We go a step further and say, hey, do you think they should be on packages? And most consumers are yes. In every study I've done, consumers are happy to have guidance on this. Next slide. Okay, so adverse events are common, but they're common across all product forms. And we need to make sure that even though edibles has a sort of a special place with accidental consumption, that we don't think about this too narrowly. We really need to think about improving THC literacy. And consumers are very open to that type of regulation. And so is the industry for that matter. You know, they don't like additional regulatory burden, but it's in everybody's interest to help consumers to dose more effectively. Next slide. All right. Now I'm going to get into sort of first the labeling piece and then the product piece, specifically thinking about regulations and comparing some of the different jurisdictions. So let's start with labeling and warnings. Next slide. So we've got different warnings in different states. Does it make a difference which symbol states use? And as I'm going to say in a minute, we have even bigger differences when we look across all the US states compared to Canada. So first of all, I've done more research on warnings than I have a right to, and most of it is faint glimpses into the obvious, proving that the bigger things are, the more noticeable, the more effective they are. So the first thing is do consumers even notice and use health warnings for cannabis products? Next slide. So we asked people that, and I'm going to show you the data among past 12-month consumers. Next slide. So what do we see? 23% of all consumers in the US tell us, yeah, I've seen health warnings on cannabis packages recently. You can see that it's higher in legal states than it is in illegal states. That is what we'd expect because, of course, there's mandated packaging. But one of the things I'm going to say a couple times throughout this talk is that, and this is no news to anybody, but there's different types of illicit products and sources, but part of it is folks that live in illegal or medical states are certainly getting the products and the packaging from illegal states, from the legal market. And so what we see is that we do see sort of awareness and of packages from other states that have been diverted from a legal market. I didn't express that very clearly, but next slide. So this is sort of a fake product that I've mocked up for you, but in Canada, as you may know, we have a symbol, right? That's like the Washington sort of hand thing. And we also have, you can see our warnings. They have to be that big. They have to have that type of color scheme. We have rotating warnings. We have different warnings for different types of products, and they each focus on one particular topic. Bottom line, they're much more comprehensive than anything in the US states. Does that make a difference? Next slide. Yeah, it does. So our first surveys in Canada in 2018 were before legalization. So that first dot, that red dot, Canada's the red line here, that's before legalization. So when we ask people this question about have you seen warnings on products, you can see that Canada, within the first 12 months after legalization, pops right up to the legal US states. And then you can see it continues to increase, and it's now increased, a fair bit above the legal states. And that's what you see. Warnings, there's a wear-in effect where it sort of accumulates over time. And so this is exactly what you'd expect to see, which is we have differences between the US states, but you can see that Canada is now sort of leaving even the legal states behind. And it almost surely has everything to do with, the fact that we have more comprehensive warnings. Now, it's also, we need to remember that not all the consumers in the legal states are actually purchasing legal products. And so, next slide. One of the things that we've looked at is not just whether they notice warnings, but do people actually, can they remember the messages? Do they agree with those health effects? And the answer is yeah. We've actually, because you have different messages in different states, the easiest way of thinking about it is if you put a particular health effect on your warning, even though it might be small, more people in that state remember it than other states where that message isn't labeled. So it's not rocket science. If you put it on there, if you make it big and obvious, people are more likely to not just see it, but to actually recall the health effect and to agree with it. And we see that noticing and recall is higher among those who purchase from legal sources. So that tells us it's not just sort of the broader environment and things like education campaigns. It's seeing the actual packages, in retail settings and in the home. Next slide. And we've also done lots of experimental studies with folks in Canada and the US that basically demonstrate the same thing. When you actually experimentally manipulate the size or the color or the type of messages that are on the products, next slide, you see greater recall. And I'm not going to sort of walk through this, but it's really nice convergence between like controlled trials and then what we see at the population level with these natural experiments of different rules in different jurisdictions. Next slide. And I just put this in here because, again, there's often a narrative that consumers don't like regulation. And, certainly that's true for certain things. Consumers don't like higher taxes, for example. But I've done work in alcohol and tobacco and food and cannabis, and most consumers support comprehensive health warnings. And so we ask a question, which is say, do you support the health warnings on products? You can see that the support's actually higher in Canada, where we have the more intrusive warnings than it is in the US, but very few people are opposed. A bunch of people are neutral, most support, it's pretty hard to get agreement on most things these days, but most people seem to agree that health warnings on cannabis products are a good thing. Next slide. Now, some of you will know that it's not just the warnings, but Canada has rules about how much branding can appear on packages. So for tobacco products, we call it plain packaging. Tobacco, we have this uniform brown color. I know one advocate that refers to it as fecal brown. And all you have to have the same font size. There's no logos. Cannabis, it's a little bit more lax. You get to choose one color, and your brand information can only be as big as the THC symbol. So you see that white circle, that's as much branding as packages can have. And I've picked what I think is the same product from Colorado and Canada, and you can see the differences in terms of potential appeal. And when we talk about kids and seeing packages, there's not too many kids that are going to look at the thing on the right and go, that's for me. But, you know, we all like peaches, or at least mangoes, rather. I do. And, you know, and kids might be interested. That looks much more like a candy package. Next slide. So I'm not going to talk about that, but we've done research on that. And the bottom line is that mandated warnings are a low-cost, sustainable means of communicating with consumers. Regulators can choose whatever the heck they want to tell them, but it's a very good vehicle or mechanism for communicating with folks, and it's one that people are open to. And in a sense, in a good way, we do tend to have spillover effects because the products, albeit in illegal ways, sort of shift across into different markets. We see that U.S. consumers, even in states where it's not legal, are starting to see some of those legal warnings. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is maybe, I find it the most interesting data that I'm going to share with you today. And that is on product standards. Next slide. So I was, I read Leafly and all the industry stuff as much as I can, and I came across this one a few months ago. World's largest brownie weighs in at 850 pounds, and I have it in red there. I think it was 20,000 milligrams of THC. So the market's shifting. It's not quite shifting here, but presumably we need some kind of product standards. Next slide. So we've already heard of Quebec. So a quick recap: we have national, federal legalization, but each of our 10 provinces basically can make their own rules above and beyond the basic federal ones, and provinces control the retail market. And they control the distribution of cannabis products. So Quebec has the most comprehensive product standards of any jurisdiction in the world that's legalized cannabis. So there was a question or conversation about, how do we have products that don't appeal to kids? And by the way, federally, we have the same thing. It's right up there in our Cannabis Act. And of course, most provinces sell gummies and brownies and chocolates. Quebec has said, you know what? Kids like that, we're not selling them. So they prohibit any edible that the content of the edible could be appealing to kids. I'll say that in just a sec. They have a THC limit of 30% on every single product in the market. They have not sold any vaping liquids or oils. And there are no solid concentrates. So they sell a lot of hash, but there's no wax or shatter even that would meet the 30% threshold. A fundamentally different market. And I want to say one footnote here. It's not just product standards. Quebec, every single store is government owned. They have far fewer retail stores than any other province. They have a higher minimum legal age. They have stronger rules on cannabis marketing, and fewer people use cannabis in Quebec. So this is an example of a much broader public health framework. And as countries like Germany and Switzerland are asking questions about how to potentially legalize and regulate the market, I say, you want a public health framework? You go look at Quebec, because they are an example of that, whether other jurisdictions choose to follow or not. So strongest product standards in the world. Next slide. And, the true test, as I just said, of how committed are regulators to reducing child appeal is what they do with edibles, obviously. And here's the thing. Quebec has sold these powders that you can use as an ingredient. But until recently, they sold one. First of all, they sold no products for a long time. And then they sold one product. And it's, I'm going to get this wrong. I do speak French, but it's cinnamon dates. And by the way, earlier today, I went on the provincial, we have online legal sales everywhere in Canada. So I went on Quebec's online store, and I noticed they have some new products. But guess what products they have? They have, sounds like a joke. They have dried cauliflower, dried beets, and dried figs. Now, I have 3 kids, and they're not sneaking cauliflower or beets out of the fridge too often. So, Quebec has followed its principles here. So you can think of Quebec as basically having no edibles, except recently they've just added a few that my kids will attest to don't appeal to children. So has it made any difference? Next slide. Okay, This is the same slide I showed you earlier. It's for all of Canada, and it's just to show you that product trends among our consumers have followed a very similar trend to what I showed you in the US. I'm not going to get too into it, but you can see, for example, edibles, second most popular, really gone up along with most other forms, while dried flower is decreasing. Next slide. So, big question. So let's look at what are Quebec consumers using. So next. First, let's look at dried flower. So same restrictions as other provinces, and you can see Quebec is bang on. That sort of blue bar on the left is the Canadian average, and those other green bars are other provinces. So Quebec is right in the middle in terms of dried flower use. Next slide. Quebec allows hash up to 30%. Where is Quebec with hash? Bang on in the middle. 24% Quebec, 23% a national average. Now, let's look at what about the products that Quebec has restricted. Is it the case that people are just as likely to use them, but they source them from the illegal market? That's what the industry would suggest. Or are they actually less likely to use them? Next slide. The use of edibles in Quebec is half of what it is in any other province in the Canadian average. What about vape oils, which they've not sold? Next. Same thing. So this is dramatic. This tells you that the profile of what Quebec consumers are using is fundamentally different than in the other provinces. And it suggests that it's not the case that, oh, they'll be just as likely to use it, they'll go source them from the illegal. They're actually, we're shaping consumer trends and consumption through the types of products that are permitted. Next slide. And I just want to I told you that Quebec was different before legalization. They're certainly different after legalization. But if you back it up to even showing 1 year before legalization, Quebec is the red dotted line. The other lines are the different provinces. You can see there's dried flower and hash. Quebec's right in the middle. Next. Here's the prohibited products. So you can see they were lower prior to legalization, but we've got even more gap, more distance between them. So it's not just a carryover from pre-legalization. They were different before, they're more different now. Next slide. And that's edibles. And you can just see the stark difference there. Okay, next slide. And so I already referred to it, but the argument against product standards is that it'll sustain illicit trade. People, you're not going to change use. You're just going to be putting illegal products in consumers' hands. And we've seen this argument, when Vermont, with its different proposals for a THC limit. Next slide. So we monitor. We ask people, where did you buy it from? We ask them straight up, was it a legal or illegal store? We ask it for different product categories. We ask it for all cannabis products. And this is showing you the average, the mean percent of all cannabis products that people tell us they bought from a legal store. So pretty busy, but what you can see is each bar is a different year. It's gone up each year after legalization. That's a whole separate conversation. But you can see that Quebec is right in the middle. It's absolutely average in terms of the proportion of products that people tell us they're buying from legal sources. And by the way, our self-report data aligns very well with legal sales data that are mandated and reported to provinces and Canada. Next slide. And of those who tell us they source their products from the illegal market, we say, well, why? And one of the reasons we asked them is it because the legal products, you can't buy them? And actually, Quebec doesn't look much different than the other provinces. So they're not complaining anymore that they can't find the products they want in the legal stores. Next slide. And if we look specifically at categories of what percent do you buy legally, what we see is it is true that consumers who use vape oils and edibles in Quebec, they are more likely to tell us that they buy them illegally. That's what you'd expect because there's a lot fewer of them, but they're still using them, as I showed you. Actually, for dried flower and oral products, Quebec consumers report telling us that they have less illegal purchases. Next slide. When we ask people in Quebec, where did you get them from? You can see that they're the red bar here. They are somewhat more likely to say that they grow their own. They are somewhat more likely to say they get them from a dealer. They're much less likely to say they're getting them from a store. Those would be, for the most part, legal stores. So there are different sources. There is, some greater use of some illicit sources. Next slide. But let me try and put this back together for you and look at the overall. So if you use an edible in Quebec, you're more likely to say that you get it illegally compared to edible users in other provinces. Except if you actually look at the numbers, we have fewer people overall sourcing edibles and vape oils illegally in Quebec because there are so many fewer people using them. So each individual who uses them is more likely to get them from the illegal market, but because there's fewer consumers of those products, you actually have higher levels of people telling us that they're getting their vapes and edibles from an illegal source in the other provinces than Quebec. So I don't know if I've confused or clarified there, but I'm happy to take a question and try and do that in a minute. Next slide. And I know we're coming down on time, so I'm about to wrap up in a minute. So, one of the natural things is to be like, okay, we don't have a lot of these high THC products in Quebec, so have we seen any differences in problematic use? For example, did self-reported adverse events differ in Quebec versus the rest of Canada? And you might argue this both ways. Well, look, if they're getting illegal products that we know doesn't have proper labeling, for example, for edibles, maybe they're going to have a harder time because they're going to have a harder time figuring out how much to consume. On the other hand, maybe if we don't have these higher products and people aren't using them as much, maybe they'll report lower. So what do we actually find? Next slide. Well, a little underwhelming. We don't find any major differences. So again, if we just look among consumers, so we're sort of ironing out the difference in prevalence, you see very similar patterns. If you look among all respondents, in Quebec, any adverse event for which people sought medical help is a little lower. Any adverse event is a little lower, but sought medical help is very similar. So a similar profile of adverse events in terms of Quebec and the other provinces. Next slide. What is interesting is, remember the data I showed you before where we say, hey, what product were you using when you had that adverse event? You can see that, people in Quebec are much less likely to say edibles. That makes sense. They're less likely to use them. And they're somewhat more likely to say that they experienced an adverse event from liquid drops, capsules, and hash. So in some ways, one of the earlier talks was talking about titration and compensation. In other words, if you switch to a different product, you just change your intake so you still get the same amount of THC. We're almost seeing a type of compensation at the population level here, at least as it plays out for adverse events. Next slide. I'm going to skip over this just in the interest of time. Next slide. And next slide again. Great. And you heard Rosalie mention this, but the product standard that I'm not going to talk about is we have a federal rule that says when you buy edibles, you can have no more than 10 milligrams in the entire package. So you can have one gummy that's 10 milligrams, or you can have 4 gummies that are 2.5 milligrams, but you want 20 milligrams, you got to make 2 separate purchases of those packages. And, potentially what this means is, look, there's a lot of newer, naive consumers who we know you sell a cookie and they're going to eat the cookie, whether it has 100 milligrams, 1,000 milligrams, or 10. And so what this does is it enforces smaller units of THC, whether you can read the labels and understand them or not. And to the extent that consumers will sort of eat the typical amount that they're provided, potentially there could be differences in terms of lower consumption and less adverse events. So I'm not going to talk much about this, but it is a very important additional step beyond just trying to figure out, do you want 5 or 10 milligrams for serving size, and how are you going to communicate that to folks? Next slide. And I'm presenting these last 2 slides as teasers because it's a little bit too simplistic. But interestingly, in our data, when we asked the same questions of consumers in Canada and the US, Canadian consumers fewer of them report experiencing adverse events. So these are, again, people who told us they sought medical help for an adverse effect in the past year. And you can see, you have a few differences between the different jurisdictions in the US, but Canada is about half of what you have in medical and legal states. Next slide. We ask about accidental consumption, whether anyone in their household has consumed it. And you can see, again, Canada, goes up a touch, but not really. So we have a different trend, and we're much lower than the US. Does that have anything to do with things like edibles packaging and some of the other regulations we have? Perhaps. That's something I think is really important to look into. Next slide. Okay, so briefly, product standards. Quebec has implemented very strict standards that have basically knocked out very popular forms of cannabis use. Yes, Some consumers are still using those, and those consumers do get them from illegal sources, but they're far less likely to use them overall. And the number of folks that are sourcing those products from the illicit market is not any higher in Quebec than it is in those other provinces. You know, I think what I'm showing on adverse events is more sort of asking the question, starting to ask the question at the population level, but we really do need more evidence about product amounts and consumptions and things like that. Next slide. So I'm going to show you one more slide. Next slide. We've had some talk about THC based taxation. We have that in Canada. For dried flower, it's based on amount. It's basically 10% or $1 per gram. But for extracts, it's based on the THC content, and it's 1 cent per milligram. So what's interesting is I've just pulled a random product out. It's a 1 gram cart, vape cart, so $45. $8 of that would be in tax because it has somewhere around 800 milligrams of THC. So you can see that that's a substantial proportion of tax. What I can't tell you is if that's had any impact on, consumer patterns and shifts and the strength of THC products that they choose. Next slide. And next slide again. So we've got lots of data on price. Next slide again. I don't have time to show it to you today, but some intriguing stuff. So overall, big changes in the market, shift towards highly processed products. In our own data, we used to see bigger difference in product forms 4 years ago than we do today. And I think it goes back to what John said, which is, look, these are trends in countries that have not legalized. Some of these trends started well before legalization in Canada, for example, but legalization seems to accelerate them. And so we certainly saw that earlier with these use of extracts and high THC products. But it does appear that we might be reaching sort of a tipping point in the US where they're now very broadly diffused in terms of the use of vapes and edibles across all jurisdictions, regardless of legalization. Next slide. I said this before, but we do have evidence that product standards can shift consumption. It's not just going to shift them from the legal to illegal market. Next slide. And, a key question, I think Wayne might be speaking about this in one of the presentations that's going to follow, but, the idea of how much people can compensate or titrate for THC amount is a fundamentally important question. You could knock vape oils down to 30%. And so does it just mean that instead of taking one hit or one puff on your vape, you take two and you get the same amount as if it had 60%? Does that happen? I can tell you with nicotine, it happens unconsciously. Those are really important questions to trying to think about what product standards mean and how people might adjust. Next again. And I tell you what would be really helpful for the type of work that I do, that we're trying to do, is to try and integrate some biomarker data in large population surveys. We do collect pictures of products in some of our subsample. I'd love to do a broader product collection so we can put all these things together. Next slide. Again. Okay, great. So we have reports on some of these indicators. We have them for the overall US. We also have them for Washington with our partnership there with Washington State. I'm happy to share those if people wish. Next slide. If you have information like you want to look at the methods or detail, cannabisproject.ca. We post our reports and technical reports and papers. Thanks to our research team, we're blessed with wonderful collaborators, including a bunch that are participating today: Julia, Wayne, Rosalie, Jillian. And next slide. And I believe I'm 1 minute over, but thanks so much. Happy to answer any questions, and feel free to follow up with me if you'd like.